One of the most remarkable results of the Chanukah story 2,200 years ago in the land of Israel was that they established a new dynasty of kings, the Malchus Hashmonaim, the dynasty of Hasmonean kings, who were in fact Kohanim. And indeed, if you look in the writings of the Rambam in Hilchos Chanukah, he lists all the great achievements of the Hashmonaim at the time of Chanukah, why we're celebrating Chanukah, and one of the achievements is V'he'emidu melech min ha'kohanim v'chozra malchus liYisrael. That these Kohanim, the Bnei Matisyahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol, they established a king from among themselves, their descendants, and Chozra Malchus Yisrael, sovereignty, Jewish sovereignty, returned to the land of Israel. Remember that there hadn't been Jewish sovereignty in the Second Temple period since the destruction of the First Temple, because the Second Temple was built under the auspices of the Persian Emperor Cyrus, and later on the Greek Empire, but they weren't independent. They didn't have their own sovereignty. Chanukah gave Israel back its Jewish sovereignty. And the Rambam says that's one of the things we are celebrating. Interestingly, there are other opinions on this question, and they see in the establishment of Malchus Yisrael by the Hashmonaim, they see this as problematic. The Ramban, for example, in his commentary on Parshas Vayechi, Lo Yosor Shevet mi Yehuda, Mechoking Ubein Raglov, says that Yaakov Avinu specifically told his sons that the Malchus has to stay with Yehuda, and anyone who takes it away from him is ma'avirim nachlo, is stealing away from him his rightful part of the estate. And therefore, they did a great aveira, says the Rambam. The Hashmonaim should never have taken Malchus for themselves. And this raises all sorts of interesting questions about the Kohanim and Malchus. And incidentally, it's something which has certain modern applications to it as well, sort of where we combines the combination of political and spiritual leadership, which came together in the time of the Hashmonaim, whether this is something to be recommended or not. However, in the context of the Chanukah story, it's interesting to note that there are several Mefarshim who come to the defense of the Hashmonaim against the criticism of the Ramban. I just want to share with you one or two ideas on that subject. There is a very beautiful writings of Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, one of the Gedolei Yisrael of the previous generation, who says something very interesting. He says that of course the Hashmonaim knew Lo Yosor Shevet mi Yehuda, that really Malchus shouldn't have been theirs. It belongs only to Yehuda. But they were afraid that if they would take a descendant of David HaMelech and put him on the throne at that period in history, this would turn into a Mashiach Sheker. People would say, wow, a descendant of David HaMelech is sitting on the throne and restored Jewish sovereignty to the land of Israel. This is the Geula Achrona. This is the Mashiach that Yeshaya Hanavi had spoken about, that Zechariah had spoken about. This is it. This is the event. This is the ultimate redemption. And this would be a type of Mashiach Sheker. And they were afraid that any descendant of David HaMelech would have that impact on the Jewish people, and therefore they didn't appoint somebody from Yehuda, and they took it for themselves. This is a counsel for the defense of the Hashmonaim against the criticism of the Rambam. Interestingly, we find also in Rashi, in Parshas V'zos HaBracha, when Moshe Rabbeinu is giving a bracha to the Kohanim, one of the sentences he uses is Baruch Hashem Chayloi, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu should bless their Chayil. And Chayil means, of course, power, but it has very serious military meaning to it, right? Chayalim, the Chayil, that they are the Chayil Hashem. Why would Moshe Rabbeinu speak about the Kohanim as soldiers, when in fact Kohanim were not allowed to join the army? Kohanim were not allowed to be soldiers at all. So Rashi there says that Moshe Rabbeinu had a nevuah about a short period of time where the Kohanim would become soldiers and would attain military power, and that is the time of the Hashmonaim. That in fact this was in some way predicted or predestined, that within the kahuna there was this potential for not only spiritual leadership and teaching, but also for military and and royal status. I saw in the writings, actually, of Rav Tzadok HaKohen from Lublin, one of the great Hasidic writers and thinkers of the 19th century, where he says something very beautiful. He says that in actual fact, of course, the Kohanim were not destined to be kings, but that's only 99% true. In reality, the Kohanim did have within them a nitzotz, a spark of malchus, of being part of the destiny, of the royal destiny of Klal Yisrael. How is that? Says Rav Tzadok HaKohen, is because if you look in the Chumash, you'll find that Aaron HaKohen, who was, of course, the father of all future Kohanim, who did he marry? The Pasuk says that Aaron took Elisheva bas Aminodov achos Nachshon lo leisha, that he took a wife who was the sister of Nachshon ben Aminodov. Now we all know that Nachshon ben Aminodov was the Nossi of Yehuda. He was the prince of Yehuda, and therefore his sister, in a certain sense, was the princess of Yehuda. She brought Malchus into the family of Aaron HaKohen, and therefore she was the mother of all future Kohanim. And therefore the Kohanim have not only got the role to play of the spiritual leaders and teachers in Klal Yisrael, but they have within them a small potential. Of course, halachically, Malchus goes through the male line of the family, but because of Elisheva bas Aminodov, Achos Nachshon, that potential of Malchus, of military and royal leadership, that potential surfaced for a short time during the period of the Hashmonaim. And it's interesting, actually, that during that period of kings, most of the Hasmonean kings were, from a Torah point of view, failures. In other words, they abandoned Judaism in favor of wealth and power and Hellenism, and really drifted away from authentic Judaism. However, we do have one very interesting moment during that period of the one and only time in history, in the Jewish history, where we had a Jewish queen, and that was Shlomtzion HaMalka, the wife of Yanai HaMelech, and she turned out to be a tzadekes, a woman of great spiritual power as well. So maybe in some way, Shlomtzion HaMalka was in some way a new reincarnation, in some sense, of Elisheva bas Aminodov, that she was able to preserve the female spark of Malchus, genuine Malchus. She was also the sister of Shimon ben Shetach, who was the Av Bezdin at the time, at the Sanhedrin. So she was a woman of great significance, and it's interestingly connected to the origin of Malchus among the Hashmonaim. So we find here, in short, that there is an interesting depth of purpose in the moment in which the Hashmonaim re-established Jewish sovereignty and brought the land of Israel back closer to Am Yisrael. And that's really part of our celebration on Chanukah, while at the same time Chazal took great care to make sure that really the celebration should focus around the Pach HaShemen, the jar of oil, because that represented the light of the Shekhinah in Klal Yisrael. Now, the Gemara says that the light of the menorah was an edus, was a testimony, Shashchina Shore B'Yisrael. That in actual fact, Klal Yisrael weren't just great military genius and military power. That's not, the Jewish people have never celebrated militarism. We always understand that any victory is a gift from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ala nisim, ala chuas, ala milchomos, she'osisa la'aveiseinu. That miracle is really based on the idea that the Shekhinah returned to Klal Yisrael, and that the light from the menorah was the light of the Ziv HaShekhinah, was the light of the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which returned not only to the Beis HaMikdash, but later on into every single Jewish home. And this is really some of the ideas which are built in to our understanding of Chanukah, that there is both a national resurgence and a return of sovereignty to the land of Israel, and a strengthening of the idea that the presence of the Shekhinah is not only in the Beis Hamikdash, but the little jug of oil has actually got infinite power to it, and it can light up every single Jewish home all around the world, and with that create the warmth, the simcha, the emunah, and the optimism which is Chanukah. I wish you all a Chanukah Sameach.